The night my daughter turned away and said, "Not tonight, Mom." I felt something inside me break. I didn't know it then, but that night would change our family forever. This is not just my story. It's a story about love, pride, and the power to heal even the deepest wounds. If you believe family stories deserve to be heard, hit subscribe, like this video, and stay with me till the end. You'll understand why this night is still etched in my heart. The clock on the nightstand ticked louder than usual, as if it too refused to sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, the room dim except for the warm, tired glow of the lamp beside me. The house was quiet now, too quiet. My hands, wrinkled and veined like the roots of an old tree, rested on my lap, but my mind was still standing in that hallway, frozen in time. I can still hear it, the soft but sharp sound of her voice. "Not tonight, Mom." Just 4 words, gentle enough to pass for casual, but to me, they landed like stones. It wasn't the words alone that hurt. It was everything buried inside them. Years of misunderstandings, missed chances, pride, and love that never quite found the right shape. I remember the way the hallway light spilled onto the floor that night. I had brought her favorite stew, wrapped in towels to keep it warm, just like I did when she was little. I remember knocking softly, already smiling, waiting for her to open the door. When she did, her face was tired, more tired than I'd ever seen it. She looked at me not as a mother, not even as family, but almost like an obligation. "Not tonight, Mom." The door didn't slam, it closed gently, almost politely, but the silence afterward was louder than any door slam could have been. I stood there, hand hovering in the air, still holding the pot like some fool waiting for a welcome that would never come. The hallway was cold, the world outside was darker than usual. My breath fogged in the night air as I walked slowly back to my car. Every step echoed in the silence, as if the ground itself was reminding me that something had shifted. People think rejection always comes in dramatic ways, shouting, slammed doors, angry words, but no. Sometimes rejection comes wrapped in politeness. Sometimes it whispers instead of screams. And that's exactly why it cuts so deep. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before I could turn the key. The pot sat on the passenger seat beside me, still warm, still smelling like home. I stared at the light shining faintly through her curtains, and for the first time in years, I felt like a stranger outside my own child's world. That night, when I got home, I didn't turn on any lights. I just sat in the kitchen, in the dark, the clock ticking, the house creaking with the weight of memories. My mind kept circling back not just to the words she said, but to all the words we hadn't said, the things I'd held back, the moments I'd thought, later, we'll talk about it, but later never came. That it wasn't about Stu. It wasn't about a tired evening. It was everything that came before. Years of me working while she grew up too fast. Years of her learning to live in a world that I never fully understood. Years of both of us loving each other but speaking different languages. I ran my fingers across the edge of the bed, feeling the fabric catch against my skin. I had held her in these hands when she was small, through fevers, through nightmares, through every scraped knee and broken heart. I thought that kind of love was unbreakable. But love, when it's left unspoken too long, can grow brittle like old glass. The memory of that night plays in my head like an old film reel. Her tired eyes, the door closing, the hallway, the cold. Sometimes I wonder if she heard the sound of my heart cracking through that silence. I took a deep breath, my chest rising slowly. I wasn't crying, not yet. At my age, pain doesn't always come with tears. It settles somewhere deeper, like a weight you learn to carry because no one else can. I looked out the window. The neighborhood was still, bathed in the soft orange glow of the streetlight. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere, another family was laughing. And here I sat, alone with a memory that wouldn't let me rest. I wish I could tell you that was just another night, that I brushed it off, that I understood, but I didn't, because deep down, something in me knew this wasn't about a tired evening or bad timing. It was a fault line that had been forming for years, and that night, it finally cracked. I didn't know it then, but that night would be the beginning of everything unraveling. When I think back to those early years, I don't remember rest. I remember motion, the kind that starts before the sun rises and doesn't end until long after it sets. My daughter was only 3 when her father passed. One day, he was there laughing, fixing the old radio, holding her in his arms like she was made of light, and then he wasn't. The world didn't stop to give me time to understand. Bills still came. The rent still needed to be paid. My little girl still needed to eat, to smile, to feel safe. I was young, but grief ages you quickly. I found work wherever I could, cleaning offices downtown before dawn, washing dishes in the afternoons, sewing late into the night. My hands were never soft again after that. The cold water, the bleach, the endless scrubbing, they turned my fingers into something rough and strong. Every blister, every cut, felt like proof that I was still standing. We lived in a small, creaky apartment on the edge of town. The walls were thin, the pipes moaned like old ghosts at night, and the floorboards complained under every step. But to me, it was a fortress. I taped pictures of flowers to the peeling walls so my daughter would see color when she woke up. I cooked with spices that reminded me of home, filling the air with scents that made the cramped kitchen feel like a celebration. Every morning, I'd tiptoe out while she slept, leaving her in the care of Mrs. Alvarez down the hall. I'd whisper a quiet promise before closing the door. "I'll make this better. I'll give you more." Those words became my prayer. America was both cruel and kind to me. The hours were brutal, the language foreign, the faces often indifferent, but the promise of possibility, it burned bright. If I worked harder than anyone else, if I saved every penny, maybe I could give her what I never had: stability, opportunity, pride. I remember one winter in particular. The heat went out in the building. The landlord didn't care, and no one had the money to fix it. So I bundled her in every blanket we owned, tucked her against me at night, and boiled water on the stove to keep the kitchen warm. She'd press her tiny hands against my face and whisper, "You're warm, Mama." She didn't know that my warmth was all I had to give. There were nights when exhaustion would pull me down like a heavy tide. I'd be scrubbing floors at midnight, my body aching, eyes burning, and I'd think about her sleeping in the next room. That thought was enough to keep me moving. Every sacrifice had her name written on it. As she grew older, she became my little shadow. She'd sit on the floor while I mended clothes, handing me spools of thread like an assistant. She'd draw pictures of me in her notebooks, always with big hands. "Because you fix everything," she'd say. I didn't know then that those same hands, strong and giving, would one day feel like strangers to her. I worked extra shifts so she could go on school trips. I skipped meals so she could have new shoes. I turned down invitations to rest so I could clean one more office, fold one more shirt, sew one more hem. I thought if I gave her everything materially, if I never let her see me break, she'd grow up feeling secure, loved, unshakable, and in many ways, she did. She was bright, ambitious, full of dreams that stretched far beyond the walls of that little apartment. I loved watching her confidence bloom. She was becoming everything I hoped she would be: strong, fearless, American in ways I could never fully be. But there were small moments I brushed aside, like when she'd roll her eyes at my accent in front of her friends, or when she'd insist I drop her off a block away from school so no one would see the old car I drove, or the way she'd laugh uncomfortably when I brought homemade food to her school events. Embarrassed by the smell of spices that told my story before I could, I told myself it was just teenage phases. Everyone goes through them. I convinced myself she'd grow out of it, that love and sacrifice were a language universal enough to bridge any gap. But love, as I would learn, isn't always loud enough to drown out the world outside. She was growing up in a country that shaped her differently than it shaped me. Her world was classrooms and playgrounds, not factories and buses. Her friends had parents who spoke perfect English, wore the right clothes, drove shiny cars. She began to see herself through their eyes, and sometimes that meant seeing me differently too. Still, back then, I didn't let doubt settle. I focused on the grind, on the future. I imagined the day she'd graduate, the day I'd hand her the keys to a better life and say, "See, we made it." I thought love and sacrifice were enough. I didn't see the cracks forming beneath our smiles. The world my daughter grew up in was not the world that raised me. Hers was filled with yellow school buses, cafeteria lunches, English spelling bees, and pep rallies. Mine had been dusty roads, long lines for rations, and the quiet discipline of survival. I was still learning how to speak this country's language. She was already dreaming in it, in the beginning. I admired how icily she adapted. She soaked up the new culture like sunlight. Her English was crisp, fluent, quick. She made friends faster than I could remember their names. She'd come home with stories about her teachers, school plays, and sleepovers. I'd listen, smiling proudly, even if I didn't understand half of what she was talking about. But slowly, without either of us noticing, the distance began to form. It started with the small things. She began to correct my pronunciation at the dinner table. "It's beach, Mom, not bitch," she'd say, laughing with a teenage sharpness that made my cheeks burn. Her friends would visit after school, their sneakers squeaking on the old linoleum, their eyes scanning the room with polite curiosity. I'd offer them food, but they'd hesitate, whisper to her, then giggle. She'd wave me off, saying, "It's okay, Mom, they're not hungry." Even when I knew they would. At parent-teacher meetings, I dressed in my best clothes, the same embroidered blouse I had worn at my wedding. To me, it represented pride and tradition. To her, it represented difference. As we walked into the brightly lit school hallways, I could feel her inching a step ahead, just far enough to not seem attached. She'd speak quickly to teachers, barely translating for me. I'd nod along, trying to keep up, my accent heavy in my throat like a stone. I remember one evening vividly. It was the school's international night, meant to celebrate diversity. I spent hours cooking, carefully wrapping homemade pastries and preparing a dish my mother had once made for special occasions. I wore my traditional dress with pride, my hair pinned the way my grandmother had taught me. When I arrived at the gymnasium, the room buzzed with children in costumes and families carrying trays of food. But when my daughter saw me, her face froze not with joy, but with panic. She rushed over, whispering fiercely, "Why did you wear that? You're the only one." I looked around. She was right. Most of the parents wore jeans, t-shirts with the school logo, or modest blouses. My clothes stood out like a flag planted on unfamiliar soil. "It's our culture," I whispered back, trying to smile. "I know, Mom, but it's embarrassing. Everyone's staring." Her words hit harder than she knew. I set the tray down on the folding table, adjusting my sleeves, suddenly unsure of myself. When her friends came by, she avoided introducing me. She hovered near them, laughing nervously whenever someone looked in my direction. That night, as I stood by my food table, I watched other parents chatting easily, their English flowing like music I hadn't learned to dance to. I felt invisible, like a ghost at a party meant for the living. It wasn't just at school. It crept into everyday moments. When I picked her up from practice, she'd ask me to park around the corner so her friends wouldn't see the old dented car. She started speaking English at home, more and more, answering my questions in shorter sentences, sometimes not at all. Her clothes changed, her music changed, her laughter changed. One afternoon, she came home with a group of friends. They sat in the living room, chatting rapidly about something I couldn't follow. I brought them snacks, just like I always did, but when I offered them to one of the boys, he looked at her before answering. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. He smiled politely and said, "No, thank you, Mrs. M." Mrs. M, not Mama, not even my name, just a polite, distant title. I walked back to the kitchen, the tray still full, their laughter echoing down the hallway like a language I no longer belonged to. There were times I tried to bridge the gap. I volunteered to help with school fundraisers. I'd baked for bake sales, even though my pastries didn't look like the glossy cupcakes everyone else brought. I attended sports games, cheering too loudly in my accent, my voice rising above the crowd. I thought pride was enough, but each time, I saw her shrink just a little. Teenage rebellion is nothing new. I knew that. But what cut deepest was not her desire to be her own person, it was her growing desire not to be mine. She began spending more time at her friends' houses, where the furniture matched, the parents spoke flawless English, and no one had to translate for anyone else. She'd come home with new ways of speaking, new clothes, new ideas about the world. She rolled her eyes when I reminded her of traditions. She called me old-fashioned. She told me to relax when I asked where she was going at night. I tried to hold on tighter, but that only made her pull away faster. I enforced rules she found ridiculous, insisted on curfews that embarrassed her. She would stand there, tall and defiant, speaking to me in the sharp tones of someone who believed they were already grown. The worst moments weren't the arguments, they were the silences. Those stretches of air between us where she'd turn away mid-conversation, where my words would hang in the room, unanswered. At first, I'd follow her, repeating myself, trying to make her listen. Later, I stopped. The silence grew roots. I started watching her from doorways, the way she laughed with her friends, carefree in a way she never was with me, the way she dressed up for events that didn't include me, the way she lit up in spaces I didn't belong to. Pride and pain existed side by side inside me. I was proud she had found her place in this new world. I was pained that it seemed to require erasing me to get there. One evening, after a PTA meeting, I overheard two mothers talking near the exit. "She's such a smart girl," one said. "It's amazing how well she fits in," considering. Considering what? The other asked. The first woman lowered her voice. Well, you know, her mom barely speaks English. I'm surprised it didn't hold her back. They didn't see me standing behind them. I stood there, my hands tightening around the strap of my purse, the blood rushing in my ears. I wanted to say something, anything, but my tongue felt heavy. When my daughter came out to the car, I looked at her differently. She was radiant, confident, part of a world that looked at me as less, and for the first time, I wondered if she saw me through those same eyes. It wasn't outsiders who made me feel small that year, it was the sound of my own daughter's silence. It was late autumn. The air carried that quiet, crisp chill that sneaks under your coat and lingers on your skin. The sun had already set, leaving the sky bruised purple, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk. I stood in my kitchen, stirring a pot of stew, her favorite. The smell of simmering onions, garlic, and slow-cooked meat filled the room. It was the kind of smell that used to make her run to the table, laughing, impatient for dinner. I hadn't seen her properly in weeks. A phone call here, a quick text there, always rushed, always distracted. I'm busy, Mom, she'd say. I'll visit soon. But soon kept slipping further away. That evening, something inside me decided not to wait anymore. Maybe it was the way the house felt too quiet, or the way my hands lingered on the empty second plate I set on the table out of habit. Maybe it was simply love, tired of waiting in silence. I ladled the hot stew into a heavy pot, wrapped it in towels to keep it warm, and placed it carefully in a reusable bag. As I slipped on my coat, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. My hair was pinned neatly, my blouse pressed. I looked hopeful, like a woman about to visit her child, not a stranger. The drive to her house wasn't long, but it felt endless. The radio hummed softly, but my mind was somewhere else, remembering her as a little girl in the back seat, singing made-up songs, legs too short to touch the floor. I used to glance at her through the rearview mirror and think, everything I do is for you. When I turned onto her street, I slowed down. Her house stood there, larger than mine, newer, with the warm light of a television flickering through the curtains. I parked a little ways down, took a deep breath, and gathered the pot carefully in my arms. My hands were warm from the towels, my heart pounding. I walked up the path, each step crunching against the fallen leaves. There was a faint hum of music inside. I could see shadows moving her, probably, and maybe some friends or her husband. My throat tightened slightly. I didn't want to intrude. I just wanted to be there. I knocked softly, not too loud, the kind of knock that says, "It's me, you don't have to be afraid." The door opened after a moment. She stood there, her hair pulled back, wearing an oversized sweater and leggings. She looked tired, really tired, the kind of tired that seeps into the bones. But behind the fatigue, there was something else. Surprise. And beneath that, discomfort. "Mom," she said, forcing a smile. "What are you doing here?" I held up the bag a little, smiling shyly. "I made stew, your favorite. I thought, maybe we could have dinner together." Her eyes flicked behind her into the house. I heard voices faintly, laughter. "I didn't know you were coming," she said, lowering her voice slightly. "I'm kind of in the middle of something. I won't stay long," I said quickly. "I just wanted to see you, to bring you something warm." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Not tonight, Mom." For words. Simple. But they didn't land gently. They hit like a cold wind cutting through my coat. I blinked, not fully understanding at first. "It won't take long," I said softly. "I can just leave it on the table." Not tonight," she repeated, firmer now. Her voice wasn't cruel, but it carried a finality that left no room for me. I felt my hands tighten around the handles of the bag. The warmth of the pot seeped into my palms, grounding me in a reality I didn't want to accept. From inside. Someone called her name, light, cheerful, unaware. She turned slightly, responding with a tone she didn't use with me anymore. She looked back at me, guilt flickering across her face. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm just really tired. We'll do something soon, okay?" She began to close the door, slowly, politely, like one does with a stranger, trying to sell something they didn't ask for. In that moment, time slowed. My eyes caught everything, the way her hair curled near her temple, just like when she was little. The faint smell of her house, unfamiliar now but once born from my cooking. The way the light spilled onto the porch. A barrier I suddenly felt outside of. Memories crashed against the present like waves. Her as a little girl, running to the door to greet me after work, squealing "Mama." Her sitting at the table, slurping this very stew. giggling with broth on her chin, her teenage years, when she'd still let me braid her hair before school, all of it, flickering behind my eyes like an old film reel on the verge of burning out. And then, the door clicked shut. I stood there, my hand frozen midair, as if it hadn't yet received the message that the moment was over. The bag hung heavy at my side, the porch light buzzed faintly, my breath fogged in the cold. People imagine heartbreak as loud shouting, crying, dramatic music, but the truth is, real heartbreak is quiet. It's the sound of your own breath in the night air. It's the weight of a pot of stew in your hands, with nowhere to take it. It's standing on your daughter's porch and realizing you're no longer part of her inside. Eventually, I turned. My shoes crunched against the gravel as I walked back toward the car. I moved slowly, not because of my age, but because my legs didn't quite trust the ground beneath them. The street was empty. A single streetlight flickered overhead, its light pooling around me like a spotlight on a scene I wished I could rewrite. I opened the car door and placed the pot gently on the passenger seat. It sat there like a silent companion, still warm, as if unaware that the hands it was meant for had refused it. Before turning the key, I glanced back at her house. Through the curtains, I could see her moving around laughing now, talking and the sound didn't reach me, but I could see it. And that was enough to make something deep inside me ache. Driving home, the road blurred slightly through my tears, though they never fell all the way. My chest felt heavy, as if each breath carried a stone. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't want any sound competing with the echo of her voice. Not tonight, Mom. When I finally reached my house, it was dark. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I carried the pot to the kitchen table and sat down. The house creaked softly, as if sensing my return. I stared at the pot for a long time, the steam still rising faintly from beneath the lid. I thought of all the times I'd cooked for her, how every meal had been a language I spoke fluently, even when English failed me. Food was how I loved, how I connected. And that night, my language had been refused. The clock ticked, the walls held their silence, and I sat there, feeling like a visitor in my own story. I wish I could say I understood in that moment, that I told myself she was tired, that life was busy, that it wasn't personal, but I didn't. Because in that moment, it was personal. It was every distance that had grown between us finally taking shape in 4 quiet words. I walked back to my car that night under the streetlight, wondering if I had already lost her. The days after that night felt different, as if the air in my house had grown heavier. Morning sunlight still filtered through the curtains, the kettle still whistled on the stove, and the clock still ticked its steady rhythm, but everything sounded distant, like I was watching my own life from behind a glass wall. I stopped calling her as often. It wasn't a deliberate choice at first, just a quiet retreat, like stepping back into the shadows after reaching out and finding nothing. Each time I picked up the phone, I heard her voice in my memory. Not tonight, Mom. Those words replayed like an unwelcome lullaby, soft but relentless. The stew pot still sat in the kitchen sink. I hadn't washed it. I told myself I was letting it soak, but the truth was, I couldn't bring myself to empty it. It wasn't just food, it was hope, wrapped in spices and steam, left you neat. Nights became the hardest. I'd sit in the living room with the lights low, wrapped in a shawl, listening to the house breathe. This house, once filled with her laughter, now echoed with a silence that felt alive. It crept up behind me as I sat in the old armchair. It pressed its weight on my chest as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I asked myself over and over, was I too much, too present, too old-fashioned? Did I push her away with my constant attempts to stay close? Or did I simply never learn to speak the language of her world? Sometimes, relatives would call, not to ask how I was but to comment. There's a kind of cruelty that hides in well-meaning words. You know, maybe you should give her space, my sister said one afternoon. She's an adult now. You can't just show up uninvited anymore. Times have changed. She's always been independent. Another relative said with a shrug. She's got her own life. You can't expect her to sit and eat stew with you every night. Their words weren't malicious, but each one left a mark. They didn't see the quiet grief underneath. To them, it was a small thing, a single night, a misunderstanding. To me, it was a fracture I could feel deep in my bones. But there were others, 2 neighbors, members of the community, who noticed my quiet withdrawal. At the market, Mrs. Alvarez asked, "Why don't we see your daughter anymore? She used to come every Sunday." At church, people would glance at me with knowing eyes, some sympathetic, others judgmental. "She's busy," I'd say with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. Work, you know. But people talk. Whispers travel faster than facts. I heard the murmurs. She must have done something. Maybe she's too controlling. American kids don't like it when parents get too involved. Maybe the daughter's ungrateful. Maybe the mother is too old-fashioned. It was like standing at the center of a circle, everyone throwing their versions of the story at me, none of them true enough to fit but close enough to sting. I started avoiding gatherings, the market, church, socials, even family dinners. I told myself it was because I was tired, but really, I couldn't bear the questions anymore. I didn't want to explain the silence between me and my daughter. How could I, when I didn't fully understand it myself? The quiet became both a refuge and a prison. I'd walk through the house, touching objects that once held meaning, the framed drawing she made in kindergarten of Mom and me, the graduation photo where I held her too tightly, the old cassette tapes of her singing in the back seat. Each item was a time capsule, holding a version of her that still belonged to me. At night, memories came uninvited. They didn't arrive softly, they crashed through the door. I'd remember the night she said, "Not tonight, Mom," and then my mind would rewind through the years like a film reel. Her teenage silence, her embarrassment at my accent, her distant laugh at school events, and then it would rewind further to the little girl who used to slip her hand into mine without thinking. It was in these late-night hours that my thoughts turned inward, sharp as glass. I began to question not her love but mine. Had I loved her in a way that belonged to the past? Was my love shaped too much by duty, sacrifice, and tradition, while hers needed space, freedom, and distance? Had I clung to the role of mother so tightly that I forgot she was growing into her own person? And beneath all those questions, a quieter, more dangerous thought whispered, maybe I've already lost her. I didn't voice it to anyone. Instead, I filled my time with meaningless routines, sweeping the porch twice a day, rearranging the kitchen cabinets, ironing clothes that didn't need ironing, anything to keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't spiral. Relatives came by sometimes, dropping hints like pebbles in a pond. "You should call her," my cousin urged. "Life's too short to be proud." Others weren't so gentle. "Maybe she doesn't call because you make her feel guilty," one aunt said, her tone sharp. "You always talk about what you did for her. Kids don't like that. They want to feel free." I bit my tongue, holding back the storm rising in my chest. It wasn't guilt I wanted her to feel, it was connection. But maybe my way of showing love had turned into a weight she didn't want to carry. Meanwhile, time slipped quietly through the cracks. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Birthdays came and went with polite phone calls, not visits. Holidays were spent separately, she with her family, me with my memories. One winter evening, I found myself standing by the window, looking out at the empty street. Snow had begun to fall, dusting the ground in silence. Across the street, a family gathered around a glowing Christmas tree. Laughter spilled out of their window, bright and effortless. I stood there, the shawl pulled tight around my shoulders, feeling like I was watching a life I used to have but no longer belonged to. And yet, a small part of me clung to hope. Each night, before bed, I checked my phone. A message, a missed call, anything, but the screen remained blank, cold and glowing in the dark. The hero and villain in my story began to blur. It wasn't her, it wasn't me. It was time slipping away faster than I could hold it. It was silence thickening, like fog between us. It was pride, mine, hers, both of ours building invisible walls neither of us wanted to admit were there. Some nights, I told myself I'd call her in the morning. I'd swallow my pride, tell her I missed her, tell her the door was always open. But morning would come, and the words would catch in my throat. I'd stare at the phone, fingers hovering over the numbers, heart pounding like I was about to face a stranger. What if she's too busy? What if she doesn't pick up? What if she's moved on? So, I didn't call, and she didn't either. And between us, the silence grew roots. There's a peculiar kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being forgotten in plain sight. I began to talk to her, in my head, while cooking, while walking, while sitting in the armchair at night. I'd imagine what I'd say if she were here. I'd practice apologies I wasn't sure I owed. I'd imagine her replies, the way she used to look at me, the softness that might return. But imagination is a poor substitute for presence. The tension became almost physical, like a string pulled too tight between us. I didn't know if it would snap or if either of us would have the courage to pluck it gently back into tune. One night, sitting in the quiet kitchen, I whispered to myself, I thought silence would protect my heart, but it only built a wall between us. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't some grand epiphany or cinematic thunderstorm outside my window. It began in the quiet, the kind of quiet that had sat beside me for too long. One morning, I woke up to sunlight filtering through the curtains, landing on the old wooden table where my phone still sat untouched. The same silence, the same ache, but something inside me shifted. I was tired, not of loving her, but of letting silence speak louder than my heart. I boiled water for tea and sat at that table with a pen and a stack of yellowed stationery I had kept for years. I used to write letters often back when stamps were cheaper and words traveled through hands instead of screens. It felt fitting that if I couldn't say these words out loud, I'd write them. Words have weight when you carve them into paper. At first, my hand trembled. I didn't know where to begin, but once the pen touched the page, the years started to flow. My dearest girl, I don't know if you will read this. I don't know if you have space in your life for my words anymore. But a mother's heart doesn't know how to stay quiet forever. Do you remember the winters when the heat would go out, and I'd wrap you in every blanket we owned? You'd press your little hands to my cheeks and say, "You're warm, Mama." That warmth wasn't just from my body. It was everything I had, every ounce of strength I could give you. Do you remember the nights I came home from cleaning offices, my hands raw and tired, but I'd still braid your hair before bed because you liked it when it was smooth in the morning? Do you remember the shoes I saved for, the trips I skipped, the sleep I gave up not because I ever regretted it, but because loving you was the easiest thing I ever did? Even when life was hard. I watched you grow into a world that spoke a language I never mastered. I was so proud of how easily you belonged. I never wanted to be the thing that held you back. I wanted to be the ground beneath your feet, unseen but steady. You may not remember every sacrifice, and that's okay. Mothers don't love to be remembered for their labor. We love to see our children walk strong. But I remember every moment, every bruise, every night I whispered prayers over your sleeping face. I built a life out of thin air so you could have something solid to stand on. So when you said, "Not tonight," it wasn't just dinner that was refused. It was the bridge I'd been trying to keep between us. And though my heart cracked, I want you to know this. You carry my love in every step you take. Whether you acknowledge it or not, it lives inside you. It shaped you. It built the woman you are today. I am not writing to make you feel guilt. I am writing to remind you, my love is not fragile. It's not something you can lose by turning away for a moment. It's the kind that stays, the kind that waits, even when it aches. I will not always be here. One day, the house will grow quieter than you can imagine. But until that day, this door remains open. My heart remains open. You will always have a home here, not because of walls and keys, but because you live in every corner of my memory, every beat of my heart. Love, Mom. When I finished, the letter stretched over 4 pages, ink smudged in places where my tears had landed. But they weren't tears of weakness this time. They were tears of release. For years, I had loved quietly, hoping she'd hear it in the spaces between my words. But this letter was different. This was me speaking not through duty, not through food, not through expectations, but through raw, undeniable truth. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and wrote her address in neat, deliberate handwriting. At the mailbox, my fingers hesitated for a heartbeat on the cool metal edge. What if she ignored it? What if she threw it away? What if this was my last attempt, and it vanished into nothing? But then I remembered the warmth in her little hands against my cheeks. All those years ago, the girl who once ran to me after school, the daughter who, deep down, was still somewhere behind the tired adult eyes at that doorway. I slipped the letter in and closed the mailbox with a firm click. It was done. And then, something unexpected happened, not in real life, but in my mind. I imagined, just for a moment, if this story were happening today, not tucked quietly behind closed doors, but in the open world where people share their hearts with strangers online. I imagined someone recording me reading the letter aloud, my voice trembling but steady. I imagined the clip spreading like wildfire. Mothers like her trending across social media, comment sections filled with strangers saying, "This reminds me of my mom." Grown adults calling their parents for the first time in years, people crying over their screens, holding their own letters they'd never sent. I imagined someone saying, "She's not just a mother, she's a monument of love." Of course, reality isn't like that. There was no viral video, no sudden flood of support, just me, sitting back down at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea. The silence was still there, But it was different now. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't suffocating. Because this time, the silence held my words. I didn't know if she would read it. I didn't know if it would reach her heart or end up in some forgotten drawer. But I had spoken, truly spoken. I sent the letter, not knowing if she'd ever read it, or if it was already too late. Word travels, even when you don't intend it to. It started quietly. A cousin who'd stopped by noticed the empty chair at the kitchen table and asked if I'd spoken to my daughter. I didn't plan to share the story, but the letter had left me lighter, less guarded. So, one evening, over tea, I told her, not every detail, just enough. The stew, the silence, the letter. She listened carefully, her expression softening in places where others had only offered judgment before. By the end, she squeezed my hand. "You did the right thing," she said. "Sometimes, love needs to be spoken out loud." Of course, not everyone agreed. Word trickled through the family like wind through a fence. Some relatives called to offer kind words, encouragement, shared stories of their own fractured relationships. But others, well, families are never short on critics. "She's an adult, not a child," one relative said over the phone. "Writing a letter like that? That's too dramatic. You're making her feel guilty for living her life." Another chimed in, "You should have just moved on. Kids these days, they don't want all this emotional stuff. You have to adapt." I listened, quietly, to all of it. I didn't argue. I had learned that not every heart can understand the language of a mother's ache. Some see it as clinging, others as weakness. Very few see it for what it is. Love trying to breathe after years of holding itself in. And then something unexpected happened. My neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, the same woman who'd watched my daughter grow up from diapers to diplomas, stopped me at the mailbox one afternoon. "I heard about the letter," she said with a knowing smile. "I think it's beautiful." I blinked, surprised. "How did you?" She waved a hand. "Word gets around. But listen, you said what so many mothers never get to say. You put it on paper. That matters." That evening, at church, a woman I barely spoke to approached me after service. "I don't know you well," she said, "but your story, it reached me. I wrote to my son last night. I haven't spoken to him in 3 years." It was like dropping a stone into still water. The ripples reached places I hadn't expected. Quiet nods from elders who'd been through the same. A neighbor who left a small bouquet on my porch with a note that read, "Thank you for reminding me to speak my heart." And though it wasn't real, I couldn't help imagining how this would have unfolded in today's world. A short video clip of an old woman, sitting at a kitchen table, reading her letter aloud, her voice trembling but clear. The clip gets shared. Comments flood in. "This broke me. She sounds like my mom. I'm calling my mother right now." Hashtag letters from mothers trending overnight. People sharing their own stories, some joyful, some aching, strangers becoming a chorus of voices, echoing what so many had buried. Of course, in my quiet little world, there was no trending hashtag, but there was something real. People saw me, not as the background figure in my daughter's success story, but as a woman with a heart, with a voice, with a story of her own. And somewhere, miles away, in a house I used to enter without knocking, my daughter opened the letter. I didn't see her do it. I wasn't there. But I know the sound of tearing paper. I know the weight of words landing where silence once lived. Days passed, then a week, then 2. There was no phone call, no knock on the door, no reply letter in my mailbox. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't the cold, sharp silence of rejection. It wasn't the heavy silence of pride. It was still, expectant, as if something had been placed in her hands and she didn't quite know how to hold it yet. I sat by the window one evening, the letter I'd written no longer haunting me, but hovering like a quiet song in the background. The world outside moved, on children played, cars passed, lights flickered on in houses, but my heart was fixed on one simple hope, that she was thinking, remembering, feeling, thought. And in that silence, something began to shift. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, weeks after I had sent the letter. The sky was pale and soft, the kind of gentle blue that makes you pause at the window without knowing why. I was in the kitchen, hands deep in a bowl of dough, when I heard, it's the unmistakable sound of a car door closing in the driveway. For a moment, I froze. My mind flickered through possibilities, neighbors, deliveries, but when I wiped my hands on my apron and peered through the window, my heart caught in my throat. It was her. She stood there at the gate, hesitant, her hand resting on the latch like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to open it. She wasn't carrying anything, no gifts, no excuses, just herself. I opened the door before she could knock. We stood there, looking at each other, the space between us full of everything we hadn't said. Her eyes were tired but softer than the last time I saw them. I didn't rush to fill the silence. For the first time in a long while, I simply let the moment breathe. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice quieter than I remembered. "Hi," I replied, my hands, still dusted with flour, fidgeted against my apron. She looked around, as if reacquainting herself with the place. "Smells like home," she said. Those 3 words, they landed differently than "not tonight, Mom." They were a bridge, fragile but real. "I was making bread," I said. "Your favorite?" She smiled faintly. "Of course you were." We moved to the kitchen table, the same table where I had written that letter. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the ticking clock and the distant hum of a passing car. But the silence was no longer sharp-hit, was gentle, like a soft breath between words. Finally, she spoke. "I got your letter." My heart skipped. "Did you read it?" She nodded slowly. "I read it more than once." I didn't ask what she thought of it. I didn't need to. Her being here was answer enough. She leaned back in her chair, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea I'd poured for her. "I didn't realize how much I'd been pushing you away," she said. "I think I just got so caught up in my life, in trying to be this version of myself that fits everywhere, that I forgot where I came from. I forgot what you built for me." I listened, my eyes stinging but my chest steady. She continued, her voice trembling. "When you showed up that night, I wasn't angry, I was just tired. But instead of letting you in, I pushed you away. And then, when I read your words, I remembered everything. The stew, the winters, the sacrifices. I felt ashamed, but also grateful. And I didn't know how to face you." I reached across the table, my hand covering hers. Her fingers were warm, familiar. "You don't have to face me with perfect words," I said softly. "You just have to face me." She let out a shaky laugh, tears pooling in her eyes. "I thought love was simple," she said. "But it's not. It's messy. And I didn't know how to handle the guilt." I squeezed her hand. "Love isn't about perfection. It's about finding our way back to each other, even when it hurts." The bread finished baking, filling the house with that familiar, comforting smell. We ate together, not with the eagerness of old times, but with something quieter: mutual understanding. We didn't erase the past. We didn't pretend the pain never happened. We acknowledged it, let it sit at the table with us, and in doing so, it began to lose its power. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the kitchen in warm gold, I looked at her and saw not the distant woman at the doorway, but my daughter, the one who used to run to me, the one who'd grown and stumbled and found her way back. I realized then that home isn't built out of shared schedules or flawless conversations. It's built out of shared hearts, sometimes bruised, sometimes distant, but always reaching. They may have turned away for a night, but love never left the room. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt heavy. I sat in my armchair by the window, the same spot where I'd once stared into the night, clutching that stew pot like a lifeline. In my hands now was something different, a photograph of her as a little girl. Her smile was wide and fearless, her small hand reaching toward the camera, as if trying to pull the world closer. I traced the edges of the photograph with my thumb, remembering the weight of those early years, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the way her laughter used to fill every corner of these walls. For a long time, I thought I had lost her that night when she said, "Not tonight, Mom." But I understand now. That night wasn't an ending. It was a pause, a painful one, yes, but a pause that gave both of us space to grow, to remember, to return. I looked up, my eyes finding the invisible gaze of those listening, the way one does when telling a story not just to family, but to the world. My voice was soft, but steady. "If you believe dignity is stronger than pride, share this story." My eyes glistened, not with sorrow, but with something. Some wounds don't heal in a single conversation. Some doors don't swing open overnight. But love, real love, it doesn't vanish. It waits, it whispers, it finds its way back home. I placed the photo carefully on the table beside me, its edges catching the last light of the day. "If this story touched your heart," I continued, "subscribe, like, and share your own family stories, because somewhere out there, someone needs to be reminded that it's never too late to speak and to listen." The screen faded with the soft sound of a ticking clock, a quiet rhythm, still beating.